The sterile lights of medical station Kepler-7 hummed overhead as Nurse Rachel Morgan made her evening rounds through the quarantine wing. Her footsteps echoed against the polished floors, creating a lonely rhythm that mixed with the steady beeping of life support machines. After 3 years of working with alien patients, Rachel thought she'd seen everything. But tonight felt different. Tonight felt heavy with something she couldn't quite name. The Valith lay dying in their beds. Rachel paused at the entrance to the ward, taking a moment to prepare herself. No matter how many times she walked through these doors, the sight still took her breath away. The Valith were unlike any species humanity had ever encountered. Their bodies were made of living crystal, translucent and beautiful, catching the overhead lights and scattering them into rainbow patterns across the white walls. Each one had 6 limbs extending from a barrel-shaped torso, and their faces were geometric puzzles of shifting planes that rearranged themselves when they spoke or felt emotion. They were beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. And now they were dying, and there was nothing Rachel could do to stop it. The plague had arrived 6 months ago, sweeping through the Valith homeworld like wildfire through dry grass. Nobody knew where it came from or why it targeted the Valith specifically. What they did know was that it was merciless. Within weeks, thousands were dead. Within months, the survivors were scattered across a dozen medical stations throughout the galaxy, desperate for help that nobody seemed able to provide. Kepler-7 had become one of the main refuge hospitals. They'd taken in the worst cases, the ones other stations had given up on. Dr. Benjamin Hayes and his medical team had worked miracles with the younger Valith patients. The disease progressed slower in them, giving the doctors time to experiment with treatments, to try different combinations of medication and therapy. Some of the young ones were actually improving. But the elders were a different story entirely. Rachel stopped at the first bed and checked the monitors. Elder Vethrin lay motionless, his once bright crystalline body now clouded and dim. Dark cracks had appeared in his structure weeks ago, thin lines at first, barely visible. Now those cracks had spread like spider webs through his entire form, fracturing the once perfect crystal into fragments held together by sheer stubborn will. She adjusted his foreline, checking the flow rate even though she knew it wouldn't make much difference at this point. The medication kept him comfortable, kept the pain manageable, but it couldn't heal what was broken. The plague attacked the very molecular structure of Valith crystal, breaking down the bonds that held their bodies together. Once it reached the advanced stages, there was no coming back. Rachel had learned that lesson the hard way during her first month at Kepler-7. She'd fought so hard to save Elder Nethra, pushing for aggressive treatments, refusing to accept that some battles couldn't be won. In the end, Nethra had died anyway, but she died in pain, her last days stolen by Rachel's stubborn hope. Dr. Hayes had pulled Rachel aside afterward and taught her a lesson she'd never forget. Sometimes the kindest thing a doctor or nurse could do was stop fighting and start comforting. She moved to the next bed, then the next, checking vitals and adjusting equipment with practiced efficiency. 12 elders occupied this ward, all of them in the final stages of the plague. Some had families who visited regularly, sitting beside the beds and humming the low resonant tones that passed for Valith speech. Others had no one, their families lost to the plague or too far away to make the journey. Rachel had become something like family to those ones. She learned their names, memorized their preferences, stayed late to sit with them when the loneliness seemed too heavy to bear. It wasn't part of her job description, but she couldn't help herself. She'd been a hospice nurse back on Earth before joining the Colonial Medical Corps, working in a small facility in Colorado where she'd learned that dying alone was sometimes worse than dying itself. That was why she'd left Earth, actually. The memories had become too much. Too many deaths, too many families grieving, too many quiet rooms filled with the sound of final breaths. She'd needed distance, needed to start fresh somewhere the ghosts couldn't follow her. Except the ghosts had followed her anyway. They always did. Her grandmother's ghost most of all. Rachel shook her head, pushing the memory away. This wasn't the time for personal grief. She had patients who needed her here and now, not a nurse lost in painful memories from 2 years ago. She stopped at bed 7. Elder Rethanos lay there, his geometric face turned toward the viewport where stars glittered against the black of space. He was one of the oldest Valith at the station, nearly 300 years by human counting. His body had been magnificent once, Rachel had seen pictures, crystal so pure and clear it seemed to glow within a light, intricate patterns etched naturally into his structure that marked him as a scholar and leader among his people. Now those patterns were barely visible beneath the spreading cracks. His light had dimmed to almost nothing. According to his charts, he had maybe 3 days left. Maybe less. Rachel checked his vital signs, noting the slow but steady decline. His crystalline heart still beat, but weaker with each passing hour. His internal processes were shutting down one by one, like lights going out in a building at the end of the day. "Good evening, Elder Rethanos," she said softly, even though she wasn't sure he could hear her anymore. "I'm just checking your monitors. Everything looks stable for now." She didn't expect a response. Rethanos hadn't spoken in 2 days, hadn't moved in 3. Most of the staff assumed he was already too far gone for consciousness, existing in that gray space between life and death where the body continued but the mind had already departed. So when his translator device suddenly crackled to life, Rachel nearly jumped out of her skin. "Human." The word came through the mechanical translator clipped to his bed, flat and emotionless as all translator voices were. But there was something behind it, some quality that the machine couldn't quite capture. Urgency maybe. Or desperation. Rachel leaned closer, her heart suddenly racing. "Yes, Elder Rethanos? I'm here. Can you hear me?" One of his 6 limbs trembled, then slowly, painfully, lifted a few inches off the bed. The effort seemed to cost him everything. His body flickered, light pulsing weakly through the cracked crystal. "I have a request," the translator said. "A final request." Rachel pulled up a chair and sat down beside him, taking his crystalline limb gently in her hands. It felt cold, much colder than it should have been. "Anything, Elder. Anything I can do for you." The geometric planes of his face shifted, a slow reorganization that Rachel had learned meant deep sorrow among the Valith. "My people, we have a tradition. A final rite for the dying." Rachel nodded, listening carefully. She knew how important cultural traditions were, especially at the end. "Tell me what you need." "We must hear the songs of our ancestors before we pass," Rethanos continued, his translator voice growing weaker. "The old songs, passed down through generations. They're stored in our crystalline memory, transferred from elder to youth through resonance. Without the songs." His light flickered again. "Without the songs, our spirits cannot find their way home. We'll be lost in the darkness between stars forever." Rachel felt her chest tighten. She looked around the ward at the other 11 elders, seeing them in a new light. Not just dying patients, but people facing an eternity of being lost and alone. "I understand," she said quietly. "Would you like me to contact someone from your family? Maybe they could." "There's no one left who knows the songs." The words hit Rachel like a physical blow. Rethanos continued, his voice barely a whisper through the translator now. "The plague took the elders too quickly. The songs were never written down, never recorded. They existed only in living memory, passed through direct resonance from one generation to the next. And now?" His body dimmed even further. "Now they're gone. Lost forever. And we will be lost with them." Rachel pulled her chair closer to Rethanos's bed, her hands trembling slightly. Through the observation window, she could see Dr. Benjamin Hayes and Nurse Kelly Brooks pause their rounds, watching with curious expressions. They probably thought she was crazy. Maybe she was. What song could she possibly sing? Rachel wasn't a performer. She'd never been in a choir, never taken music lessons, never even sang karaoke at parties. The only songs she really knew were the simple ones from her childhood, the ones her grandmother used to hum while braiding Rachel's hair on summer evenings, or the lullabies she'd sing when Rachel couldn't sleep after a nightmare. Rachel's throat felt tight. She hadn't sung those songs since her grandmother died. Hadn't even wanted to think about them, because thinking about them meant remembering everything she'd lost, everything she'd been too afraid to face when it mattered most. But Elder Rethanos was dying. All 12 elders in this ward were dying, and they were facing an eternity of being lost and alone. If a simple song could give them even a moment of peace, even a small comfort in their final hours, how could she refuse? Rachel cleared her throat, feeling absolutely ridiculous. Her face burned with embarrassment as she noticed 2 more nurses stopping outside the observation window to watch. Great. An audience. That was exactly what she needed right now. She took a deep breath and started with the first lullaby that came to mind, the one her grandmother sang most often. Her voice came out weak and shaky on the first few words, cracking with nervousness and emotion. She sounded terrible. Part of her wanted to stop immediately, to apologize and retreat back into professional distance where she belonged. But she'd made a promise to a dying man, and Rachel Morgan didn't break promises. She pushed through the second line, her voice gradually growing steadier. As she sang, memories flooded back. Her grandmother's weathered hands gently stroking her hair. The smell of lavender soap and old books that always clung to Grandma's cardigan. The way the evening light would filter through the lace curtains in that tiny bedroom where Rachel had spent so many childhood summers. Rachel had loved her grandmother more than anyone in the world. And when Grandma got sick 2 years ago, when the cancer spread and the doctors said there was nothing more they could do, Rachel had frozen. She'd hidden behind her nursing training, behind professional protocols and medical procedures. She told herself that maintaining boundaries was important, that getting too emotional would only make things harder. She'd never sung to her grandmother. Never held her hand and offered that simple human comfort. By the time Rachel finally worked up the courage to visit the hospice, Grandma was already gone. The guilt had eaten at Rachel for 2 years. It was why she'd fled to the colonies, why she'd volunteered for the most distant posting available. She'd thought that putting half a galaxy between herself and Earth would somehow ease the pain. It hadn't worked. Now, singing to this dying alien elder, Rachel felt all that grief come rushing back. Tears started streaming down her face, but she kept singing, kept pushing through the simple melody. This wasn't just for Rethanos anymore. This was for her grandmother too, for all the songs left unsung, for all the comfort never offered. Something strange started happening. Rethanos' crystalline body began to glow. Just faintly at first, a soft pulse of light that seemed to match the rhythm of Rachel's song. Then stronger, brighter, his entire structure beginning to vibrate with a gentle hum that wove through her melody like a second voice. Rachel's eyes widened, but she didn't stop singing. The glow spread from Rethanos to the elder in the next bed, Elder Thysela. Her body started resonating too, creating a low harmonic tone that somehow fit perfectly with Rachel's human voice. Then the next elder joined in, and the next, until all 12 dying Valith were humming together, their crystalline bodies vibrating in perfect harmony. The sound filled the quarantine ward, beautiful and otherworldly. It wasn't just noise, it was music, real music, created by the impossible combination of human voice and alien resonance. The Valith weren't singing words, couldn't form the sounds Rachel was making, but their bodies were responding to the emotional vibrations in her song, translating them into their own crystalline language. In the observation room, Dr. Hayes grabbed his tablet, his fingers flying across the screen. Kelly pressed her face against the glass, her mouth hanging open in shock. Other medical staff began gathering, drawn by the strange and beautiful sound echoing through the medical wing. Rachel cycled through every lullaby she could remember. When those ran out, she moved on to other songs, folk melodies her grandmother had taught her, old hymns from church services she'd attended as a child, even a few simple pop songs she'd heard on the radio. It didn't seem to matter what she sang. The Valith responded to all of it, their bodies creating harmonies that shouldn't have been possible. The monitors throughout the ward started showing something incredible. The elders' vital signs, which had been erratic and declining for weeks, suddenly synchronized. Heart rates matched rhythm. Brain activity patterns aligned. They weren't getting better exactly, but they weren't getting worse either. They'd stabilized into something peaceful, something that looked almost like meditation. As Rachel sang, she noticed the air in the ward beginning to shimmer. At first she thought it was just tears blurring her vision, but no, there was definitely something happening to the atmosphere itself. Heat waves, maybe? But the temperature hadn't changed. If anything, the room felt cooler than before. The shimmer intensified, creating ripples in the air around the Valith beds. Rachel's voice faltered for a moment as she watched geometric patterns forming in the empty space, lines of light that connected the 12 elders like some kind of glowing web. Dr. Hayes' voice crackled through the intercom, startled and confused. "Rachel, we're picking up massive energy readings in your ward. Quantum resonance patterns off every scale we have. What's happening in there?" Rachel didn't know how to answer. She didn't understand what was happening any better than he did. All she knew was that the dying elders seemed peaceful for the first time in weeks, and that continuing to sing felt like the most important thing she'd ever done in her life. The temperature dropped suddenly, dramatically. Rachel's breath misted in front of her face. Frost began forming on the observation window. The medical equipment beeped in alarm as sensors registered the impossible temperature change. And then Elder Rethanos opened his eyes fully and looked directly at Rachel. His geometric face shifted into an expression she'd never seen before, not pain or sorrow, but wonder. Pure, absolute wonder. "Impossible," he whispered through his translator, his voice stronger than it had been in days. "I see them. The ancestors. They're here." Rachel's song died in her throat. "What?" Rethanos lifted one trembling limb and pointed at the empty air beside his bed. "Can you not see? They've come. The songs called them home." Rachel looked where he was pointing and saw nothing but shimmering air and strange patterns of light. But as she stared, as her eyes adjusted to the weird energy filling the room, she began to make out shapes in the shimmer. suggestions of forms. Outlines of beings that weren't quite there but weren't quite absent either. Her heart hammered in her chest. This wasn't possible. This couldn't be real. But Rethanos was smiling, or doing whatever the Valith equivalent of smiling was, and all around the ward, the other elders were stirring, their dimmed lights brightening as they looked at things Rachel couldn't quite see. Please, Rethanos begged, his voice urgent. Don't stop singing. Your voice is the bridge. Without it, they'll fade. Please, human Rachel. Please keep singing. Rachel's hands were shaking so badly she had to grip the arms of her chair to steady herself. Her voice had died mid-word when she'd seen the shapes forming in the air, but now Elder Rethanos was begging her to continue. The desperation in his mechanical translator voice cut through her shock. She drew a ragged breath and started singing again, her voice thin and wavering. The moment the first note left her lips, the shapes in the air solidified slightly, becoming more defined, more real. That's when every alarm in the quarantine ward erupted at once. Sirens wailed from every corner of the room. Red emergency lights began flashing along the ceiling, bathing everything in pulsing crimson. The sudden chaos shattered the peaceful atmosphere that Rachel's singing had created. Her voice faltered again, and immediately the spectral shapes began to fade. Keep singing. Rethanos cried out desperately. In the observation room, Dr. Benjamin Hayes was shouting orders, his face pressed against the frost-covered window. Rachel could barely hear him over the alarms, but she saw him pointing frantically at his tablet. Kelly Brooks was running between equipment stations, her eyes wide with panic. The monitors throughout the ward started going haywire. Screens flickered with static, numbers scrolling too fast to read. Several displays sparked and went completely dark, overwhelmed by whatever energy was flooding the room. The life support machines stuttered, their steady beeps turning erratic. Dr. Hayes's voice boomed through the intercom system, barely audible over the chaos. Evacuate immediately. Everyone out of the quarantine ward now. Rachel, you need to leave this second. Rachel looked at the 12 elders, at Rethanos' pleading face, at the half-formed shapes hovering in the air around them. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to follow protocol, to get to safety. But she couldn't move. Something deeper than instinct kept her rooted to that chair. She wouldn't leave. Not now. Not when something impossible and sacred was happening right in front of her. Rachel started singing again, louder this time, pushing her voice over the alarms. An old hymn her grandmother used to sing in church, something about amazing grace and being found after being lost. The words felt appropriate somehow, even if she wasn't entirely sure what was happening. The spectral shapes solidified further in response to her voice. They were becoming clearer now, detailed enough that Rachel could make out actual features. They looked like Valith, but different, older somehow, more intricate. Their crystalline forms were covered in elaborate patterns that modern Valith didn't have, geometric designs that seemed to shift and flow across their translucent bodies like living tattoos. The ancestors. They had to be. Just like Rethanos had said. There were 12 of them, one hovering near each dying elder. They were beautiful in a way that made Rachel's chest ache. Beautiful and terrifying at the same time. Their bodies existed in some state between solid and liquid, between matter and pure light. Looking at them directly made her eyes hurt, like staring at the sun, but she couldn't look away. More equipment shorted out with sharp popping sounds. Sparks flew from a monitor near bed 3. The temperature in the ward had dropped so low that ice was forming on the metal bed frames. Rachel's breath came out in thick clouds of mist, and her fingers were going numb from the cold. Kelly's voice crackled through the intercom, high-pitched with fear. Dr. Hayes, the energy readings are off every scale we have. Quantum resonance levels that shouldn't be possible. The equipment can't handle it. Then shut it all down. Hayes shouted back. Cut power to the entire ward if you have to. Rachel Morgan, this is a direct order, evacuate now. Rachel kept singing, her teeth chattering from the cold but her voice steady. She'd stopped questioning what was happening, stopped trying to make sense of it through logic or science. Something beyond understanding was unfolding, and the only thing that mattered was not breaking whatever fragile connection her voice was creating. One of the ancestors turned its attention toward her. The weight of its gaze hit Rachel like a physical force. She felt pinned to her chair, unable to move even if she'd wanted to. This being was ancient, she could sense it somehow, could feel the weight of centuries or maybe millennia pressing against her consciousness. It had lived and died long before humans ever left Earth, before humanity even knew other intelligent species existed. And it was looking at her with something that felt like curiosity mixed with confusion. The ancestor drifted closer, moving without actually walking. It seemed to glide through the air like smoke, its form rippling and shifting as it approached. Rachel's heart hammered so hard she thought it might burst from her chest, but she didn't stop singing. Couldn't stop. Something told her that stopping now would be catastrophic. The ancient being reached out with one crystalline limb that wasn't quite solid and touched Rachel's shoulder. Cold exploded through her body, so intense it burned. But it wasn't just physical cold, it was something deeper, something that went beyond mere temperature. Rachel felt the ancestors' presence flood into her mind, not violating or invading, but sharing. Communicating in a way that had nothing to do with words or language. She heard, felt, experienced sound in a way she'd never imagined possible. It was like the ancestor was singing directly into her consciousness, bypassing her ears entirely. The song wasn't made of notes or melody in any conventional sense. It was pure resonance, the sound of crystals growing deep underground over millions of years, the vibration of starlight hitting planetary surfaces, the mathematical harmony of quantum particles dancing in perfect synchronization. And woven through that alien song, impossible and inexplicable, Rachel heard her grandmother's voice. Singing the lullabies. The exact same lullabies Rachel had just been singing to the elders. Rachel gasped, tears streaming down her frozen cheeks. Grandma? The word came out as a choked whisper between song verses. The ancestors' song shifted, becoming questioning. Its patterns of light pulsed in what felt like confusion. Through the bizarre connection they shared, Rachel understood what it was asking without any words being spoken. Why is your gift so powerful? What are you? What are humans? More ancestors turned their attention toward Rachel now, drawn by the mystery. They drifted closer, surrounding her chair, their ancient presences pressing in from all sides. Rachel felt analyzed, studied, examined by minds that operated on wavelengths humans weren't designed to perceive. But they weren't threatening. They were just deeply, profoundly curious. Elder Rethanos pushed himself up in his bed with effort, his cracked body somehow holding together through sheer determination. His translator crackled to life. The ancestors are asking about you, Rachel. About your species. They say human songs carry something they've never encountered before in all their thousands of years. Something that shouldn't exist. Something that bridges realities that should remain separate. Rachel didn't know how to respond to that. She was just a nurse from Colorado who'd learned some old songs from her grandmother. How could that possibly bridge realities? But she could feel her grandmother's presence now, growing stronger with every note she sang. Not just a memory, something more real than that. As if the same bridge that was bringing the Valith ancestors across death was pulling human spirits along for the ride. Dr. Hayes's voice cut through the intercom again, but now it carried a different tone. Not anger or panic, but shock. Rachel, we're getting reports from all over the station. Every Valith on Kepler 7 has collapsed. All 3,000 of them. They're in some kind of trance state, their bodies resonating with the same frequency as your ward. Rachel's eyes widened, but she forced herself to keep singing. Whatever was happening was bigger than just these 12 elders. Much bigger. The ancestors began to sing with her, their crystalline resonance weaving through her human melody to create something entirely new. The harmony filled the ward, filled the entire medical wing, possibly filled the whole station. It was the sound of two completely different species, one living, one dead, finding common ground in music. Kelly's frightened voice came through the speakers. Dr. Hayes, we're detecting more energy signatures forming. Not just in the quarantine ward. Throughout the entire station. Whatever Rachel did, it's spreading. That's when the observation window exploded inward. The observation window didn't just crack or shatter. It exploded inward with a force that sent razor-sharp fragments flying across the quarantine ward. Rachel threw her arms up instinctively, still singing even as glass shards tore through the air around her. But the pieces never reached her. One of the ancestors moved faster than Rachel's eyes could track, positioning itself between her and the deadly spray of glass. The fragments passed straight through its translucent form and clattered harmlessly to the floor behind it. The ancient being had somehow shielded her without even being fully solid. But the real danger wasn't the broken window. Something else was coming through the opening. Rachel couldn't see it clearly, her eyes refused to focus on it properly. It was like trying to look at a heat shimmer on a summer road, except this shimmer felt wrong. Predatory. Hungry. Every instinct Rachel possessed screamed at her to run, to get as far away as possible from whatever this invisible thing was. The moment it entered the ward, every ancestor reacted at once. Their forms blazed with sudden brilliant light, and they moved to create a protective circle around the dying elders and Rachel. The temperature plunged even lower, so cold that frost spread across the walls in visible waves. That's when the real chaos began throughout Medical Station Kepler 7. Somewhere in the distance, a massive impact shook the entire structure. The floor lurched beneath Rachel's feet. Warning sirens that had been blaring at one pitch suddenly changed to a different, more urgent tone, the hull breach alarm. The worst sound anyone on a space station ever wanted to hear. Emergency bulkheads began slamming shut throughout the complex, massive metal doors closing automatically to contain the breaches and prevent total atmospheric loss. Rachel could hear them through the walls, each one making a thunderous boom that rattled her bones. The red emergency lighting that had been flashing now went solid, bathing everything in crimson. Through the station's intercom system, Rachel heard screams. Distant but terrifying, the sounds of people caught in corridors when the bulkheads closed, or worse, people in sections that were actively venting atmosphere into the black vacuum of space. Medical staff shouting for help. Civilians crying out in panic. Children wailing for their parents. People who'd woken up this morning never expecting to die today. Rachel's voice wavered, horror threatening to choke off her song entirely. But she forced herself to keep going, to push through the fear. Because now she understood something crucial. The invisible thing in the ward wasn't alone. Whatever had just attacked the station, it had brought friends. Lots of friends. Dr. Benjamin Hayes burst through the quarantine ward door, Kelly Brooks right on his heels. Both of them were breathing hard, their faces pale with fear. Hayes's tablet was in his hand, its screen showing damage reports that were updating faster than anyone could read. "Rachel, we have to evacuate right now." Hayes shouted over the alarms. "The hull breach is spreading through the medical wing. This entire section is going to lose atmosphere in less than 10 minutes. Rachel shook her head violently, not stopping her song even for a second. She tried to gesture at the ancestors, at the invisible threat they were fighting, but her hands were shaking too badly to communicate anything useful. "I can't stop singing," she finally managed to shout between verses, her voice raw from the effort of maintaining the melody through mounting terror. "If I stop, the ancestors disappear. We need them." "Need them for what?" Kelly cried out, looking around the freezing ward with confused fear. "Rachel, there's nothing here but dying patients and broken equipment. Whatever you think you're seeing." She never finished that sentence. The invisible predator moved, and suddenly it became visible. Just for a fraction of a second, just long enough for human eyes to register what they were facing. Rachel saw something that her brain couldn't properly process, a writhing mass of shadow-given form, all tentacles and wrongness and angles that bent in directions that shouldn't exist in three-dimensional space. No eyes, no face, nothing remotely human or even alien in any comprehensible way. Just hunger. Pure, mindless, terrifying hunger. Kelly screamed. Dr. Hayes stumbled backward, his tablet clattering to the floor. Three ancestors converged on the thing, their crystalline forms blazing with light so intense Rachel had to look away. Where their energy touched the shadow creature, it sizzled and sparked like oil hitting a hot pan. The creature shrieked, a sound that bypassed Rachel's ears entirely and went straight into her skull, triggering every primal fear response evolution had programmed into human DNA. The thing flickered and vanished again, slipping back into invisibility like a shark diving beneath dark water. What the hell was that? Hayes gasped, his professional composure completely shattered. Elder Rethanos's voice came through his translator, calm despite everything. "The Shroud Collective. The ancient enemy. They hunt in darkness, invisible to most species. Only Valith could sense their quantum signatures. That's why they engineered the plague, to eliminate the only species that could detect them. But we can't see them." Kelly protested, her back pressed against the wall. "How are we supposed to fight something invisible?" "You can't," Rethanos replied simply. "But she can." Every eye in the room turned to Rachel. The nurse sat frozen in her chair, still singing on autopilot, her mind struggling to catch up with what Rethanos was implying. The ancestor that had touched her shoulder earlier moved closer again, and Rachel felt its presence flood her consciousness once more. This time the communication was clearer, more urgent. "Your songs make us visible. Give us form. Give us strength. But they do something else too, something we never expected. Your human voices create ripples in quantum space. When you sing, the invisible becomes visible. The hidden becomes exposed. You are weapons against the darkness." Rachel's eyes widened as understanding crashed over her. When she'd been singing, really focusing on the music and emotion, she'd been able to see the shroud creature. Just barely, just at the edges of her vision, but she'd seen it. Her human song was somehow illuminating things that should remain hidden. Another massive impact rocked the station. This one was closer, somewhere in the medical wing itself. The walls groaned under stress they weren't designed to handle. Somewhere nearby, Rachel heard the distinctive whoosh of atmosphere escaping through a breach. Dr. Hayes checked his tablet with shaking hands. We've got multiple hull breaches now. At least 20 throughout the station. Nothing's showing up on sensors, but the damage is real. Whatever these shroud things are, they're everywhere. He looked up at Rachel, and she saw something she'd never seen in the confident doctor's face before: total helplessness. Our weapons are useless. You can't shoot what you can't see. Security forces are firing blind and hitting nothing. Kelly had pulled out her own tablet, cycling through security camera feeds. Her face went even paler. Oh God. The civilian shelters on Deck 7. Something's in there with them. People are dying and they can't even see what's killing them. Rachel's heart clenched. She thought of all those families, all those children who'd been terrified by the alarms and run to the designated safe zones, thinking they'd be protected there. Instead they'd been herded into killing boxes. She had to do something. But what? She was one person with one voice, and the Shroud Collective was attacking the entire station simultaneously. That's when she heard it, faint but growing stronger. Voices. Human voices, coming through the intercom system. Singing. At first it was just one or two people, their words barely audible over the alarms and chaos. But then more joined in, and more, until Rachel could make out the melody clearly. Someone had started singing the same lullaby she'd been using, and it was spreading through the station like wildfire. Medical staff in the emergency bays were singing while they treated injured patients. Engineers sealing hull breaches were singing between welding torch strikes. Security forces guarding the civilian shelters had put down their useless weapons and started singing instead. Even some of the civilians themselves had joined in, their terrified voices shaking but determined. Hundreds of human voices throughout Kepler 7, all singing the same simple melody Rachel had learned from her grandmother. And something impossible began to happen. New figures started appearing in the quarantine ward. Not Valith ancestors this time, human ones. Translucent forms flickering into existence, looking confused but determined. Rachel saw a soldier in an old military uniform she recognized from history books, his rifle held at the ready. A doctor in old-fashioned medical whites appeared next, her gentle face set with fierce determination. More and more came through, drawn by the collective human song. Dr. Hayes stared at one of the figures, his face going slack with shock. "Dad?" he whispered. The spectral man, older, with Hayes' same jawline and serious eyes, turned and nodded once. Then he moved to stand beside the Valith ancestors, facing the invisible threat. Rachel felt tears streaming down her face again as her grandmother's form solidified beside her chair. The old woman looked exactly as Rachel remembered her, gray hair pulled back, laugh lines around her eyes, that familiar warm smile. Her lips moved, singing silently along with Rachel's voice. Kelly had fallen to her knees, staring at a young man in an engineering uniform who'd appeared near the door. "Brother," she choked out. "You came back." The quarantine ward had transformed into something that defied everything Rachel understood about life, death, and the universe. Living and dead stood side by side, human and alien united by nothing more than song and desperate need. The battle that followed was something Rachel knew she'd never find words to properly describe, not if she lived another 100 years. The ancestors, both human and Valith, moved through the quarantine ward like living weapons made of light and memory. Every time a shroud creature tried to materialize, tried to attack the living people huddled in terror, the dead were there to meet it. Crystal met shadow. Light met darkness. The spirits of soldiers who'd died in wars centuries ago fought alongside ancient Valith scholars who'd passed away thousands of years before humanity ever reached the stars. And through it all, Rachel sang. Her voice was growing hoarse and ragged, her throat raw from the effort, but she couldn't stop. Every time she wavered, the ancestors began to fade, and the shroud creatures pressed closer. Kelly joined her song, her voice stronger now that the initial shock had worn off. Then Dr. Hayes started singing too, stumbling over half-remembered words but trying his best. Throughout the station, hundreds more humans sang with them, creating a chorus that echoed through every corridor and compartment. The Shroud Collective had made a fatal mistake. They'd assumed humans would be easy prey, just another species to eliminate before the threat could spread. They hadn't understood what humanity really was, what made them different from every other species in the galaxy. Humans didn't just communicate through words or logic. They communicated through emotion, through stories, through songs that carried the weight of their entire history. Every lullaby held generations of mothers comforting frightened children. Every battle hymn carried the courage of soldiers facing impossible odds. Every folk song contained the wisdom of grandparents passing knowledge to the young. Human music wasn't just entertainment, it was condensed human experience, emotional memory stored in melody and rhythm. And somehow, in ways that defied every law of physics Rachel had ever learned, those songs could bridge the gap between life and death itself. The fighting raged for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. The shroud creatures kept coming, kept trying to reach the humans, but the ancestors held the line. Slowly, gradually, the tide began to turn. The shadow beings started retreating, pulling back from sections they'd already breached, fleeing toward their ships in orbit. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the attack ended. The last shroud creature vanished from the ward. Through the broken observation window, Rachel could see flashes of light in the darkness of space, the shroud vessels destroying themselves rather than be captured, their dark matter hulls collapsing into nothing. Silence fell across Medical Station Kepler-7. The alarms finally cut off, leaving only the sound of hundreds of humans gasping for breath, their voices spent from singing. Rachel's song trailed off into nothing. She slumped in her chair, completely exhausted, every muscle in her body trembling. Around her, the ancestors began to fade. Their mission complete, they were returning to wherever they'd come from, slipping back across the veil between life and death. Her grandmother lingered just a moment longer than the others. She reached out with one translucent hand and touched Rachel's cheek, a touch that felt warm despite having no physical substance. Rachel heard words that weren't spoken aloud, words that bypassed her ears and went straight to her heart. "I'm proud of you. I was always proud of you. You gave me the greatest gift at the end, you sang for me through these dying strangers. You found the courage I always knew you had. I love you, Grandma," Rachel whispered, tears streaming down her face. The old woman smiled, and then she was gone. 3 weeks later, the conference room on Medical Station Kepler-7 held what was possibly the most unusual gathering in human history. Rachel sat at the long table feeling deeply uncomfortable in the formal clothes they'd given her. The outfit was too stiff, too official, too everything that she wasn't. She was a nurse, not a diplomat or military officer or whatever they expected her to be now. But apparently saving an entire space station from invisible interdimensional predators had drastically changed her job description, whether she liked it or not. To her left sat Captain Tom Mitchell, a stern-faced military officer representing Earth's colonial authority. He'd arrived on Kepler-7 2 days after the attack with a whole team of government officials and scientists, all of them demanding answers Rachel didn't know how to give. To her right sat Ambassador Kelthus of the Valith Concordance, fully healed now. The plague that had been killing him and the other elders had completely reversed once the shroud's influence was driven away. His crystalline body gleamed with perfect clarity, catching the conference room lights and scattering rainbow patterns across the walls. Dr. Benjamin Hayes sat further down the table as the station's chief medical officer, looking almost as uncomfortable as Rachel felt. Kelly Brooks was there too, brought in to take notes since she'd witnessed everything firsthand. But the really intimidating part was the holographic projections lining the other side of the table. Representatives from 6 different alien species, all of them watching Rachel with expressions ranging from curiosity to suspicion to barely concealed fear. The attack on Kepler-7 had sent shockwaves through the entire galactic community. Everyone wanted to know what had happened, and more importantly, what it meant for the future. Coordinator Tesh spoke first. He was a Macron, a species with 4 arms and skin that looked like polished bronze. His people had been neighbors with the Valith for centuries, trading partners and occasional rivals. He leaned forward, his 4 hands pressed flat against the table, his multiple eyes focused intently on Rachel. "Let me make sure I understand what you're claiming," Tesh said, his voice carrying a hint of skepticism. "Humans can somehow weaponize their dead? Turn deceased ancestors into soldiers?" Rachel felt her face flush with anger. That wasn't what had happened at all, and hearing it reduced to such cold military terms made her stomach turn. But before she could respond, Ambassador Kelthus spoke up. "That is not an accurate characterization, Coordinator," the Valith said firmly, his translator rendering his crystalline speech into precise words. "The ancestors did not come because humans commanded them. They came because they were called by love, by grief, by the emotional bonds that transcend death itself. What Nurse Rachel did was not weaponization, it was connection. A connection that destroyed an entire Shroud collective attack force," Captain Mitchell interjected, and Rachel heard the calculation in his voice. He wasn't interested in the spiritual or emotional aspects of what had happened. He only cared about military applications. A connection that made invisible enemies visible and gave us the ability to fight back against a threat we didn't even know existed until 3 weeks ago. A holographic representative from the Helion Collective, a species that looked like walking plants with delicate flower-like heads, rustled their leaves nervously. This raises serious concerns. If humans possess this ability, if they can bridge life and death through simple songs, what else might they be capable of? What other fundamental laws of the universe can they bypass? Rachel had been sitting quietly, trying to let the important people handle the discussion, but she couldn't stay silent anymore. These aliens were talking about her species like they were weapons or threats or science experiments, and it made her blood boil. "We're people," Rachel said, her voice cutting through the diplomatic chatter. Everyone turned to look at her. "We're not weapons or threats or mysteries to be solved. We're just people who love our families and remember our dead and sometimes sing songs to comfort each other. That's all this is." "That's all?" Coordinator Tesh's multiple eyes blinked in what might have been surprise. "Nurse Rachel, you called spirits back from death. You created a bridge between life and the afterlife. You exposed enemies that have hunted in darkness for millennia. That is considerably more than just singing songs." "But that's exactly my point," Rachel insisted, leaning forward. "We didn't do anything complicated or high-tech or militaristic. I sang a lullaby my grandmother taught me when I was 5 years old. Other humans heard it and joined in because that's what humans do. We share music, we harmonize, we find common emotional ground. There was no strategy or weapon system or special training. There was just grief and love and memory." Dr. Hayes pulled up data on his tablet. "Our research over the past 3 weeks supports Rachel's assessment. The quantum bridge effect only manifests when humans experience genuine emotional resonance. We've tried having soldiers sing under orders, scientists sing in controlled experiments, actors sing while pretending emotions. None of it works. The bridge only opens when the emotion is real and authentic. Which means you cannot weaponize it," Ambassador Kelthis added, his crystalline face shifting into what Rachel had learned was a Valith expression of satisfaction. "You cannot order soldiers to love their grandparents more deeply. You cannot command grief or manufacture authentic connection. The human gift exists outside military control." Captain Mitchell's jaw tightened. Rachel could practically see him mentally rewriting his reports, watching his plans for voice-bearer battalions and strategic ancestor deployment crumble into nothing. Good. Those plans had been horrifying from the moment he'd first mentioned them. A new holographic figure spoke up, Ambassador Chen of the Drift Collective, a species of energy beings who barely had physical form. "The question remains, however, what happens next? The Shroud Collective now knows about humanity's ability. They'll target human populations, seek to eliminate this threat before it spreads. By exposing the Shroud, Nurse Rachel has painted a target on every human in colonized space." The weight of those words hit Rachel like a physical blow. She hadn't thought about that. She'd been so focused on surviving the immediate crisis, on saving the people in front of her, that she hadn't considered the larger implications.